Hello, fellow readers and booktubers. First of all, let me just say, in case any of you may have noticed, I did not post anything last week. I was distracted by some personal business. Nothing sensational, certainly nothing scandalous, but I was kind of drawn away from BookTube for almost an entire week. It didn't keep me from reading, though, so what I want to do in this post is just bring everybody up to date as to what I've been reading, what I was reading last week, what I'm reading right now, and tie up some loose ends there. First of all, still with T.S. Eliot and has selected Prose. I mentioned 2 weeks ago that currently T.S. Eliot is my side book, the book that I dip into every now and then, read another one of his essays regarding, it's mostly literary criticism. I'll read one of his essays and then move on to some other things. I return to him about once a day. So there's T.S. Eliot, really interesting stuff, very complex writer, sometimes controversial. I understand, some people really don't like him anymore, and I can understand that sometimes. Other times I just find him incredibly witty, surprisingly witty, but never dull, never dull. So T.S. Eliot. And yes, this is the same guy that wrote The Wasteland and Cats and all the rest of that. But he's quite the intellect, quite the cultural critic during the first half of the 20th century. Also, I completed reading Ovid's love poems. Ovid is the 1st century BC Roman poet. The reason I was reading Ovid, this was largely a consequence of having finished reading a biography of Augustus. Ovid was part of Augustus's circle, his literary circle, which included Horace and, of course, Virgil, who I've mentioned many, many times. Ovid is best known for the Metamorphoses, but his collection of love poems are equally famous, maybe infamous. Some of the stuff in here is scandalous even by today's standards. I think my Latin isn't good enough that I can pass any kind of critical judgment on Ovid as a poet. I read these in English translation, but it is my understanding that those who are fluent in Latin say, oh yes, he's a magnificent Latin stylist. But as a poet, very interesting, a man about town, a bit of a rascal, a bon vivant, as they used to call him. This collection of his love poems, it's actually the Amores. There are 3 books of that. A long poem called Cosmetics for Ladies, and then The Art of Love. There are 3 books of that one, and The Cures for Love, which is a kind of a longer standalone poem, and they're all collected in this edition. I think from an historical angle, and that's how I would read this, how I read these. These poems are interesting because they reveal a lot about male-female relationships during the age of the Roman Empire, and particularly in a patriarchal society. So, women are depicted in this as either wily schemers or, the object of a hunt. Men have to be on their toes. They have to use trickery, or else the trickery of the woman will get the best of them. But there are also poems here, though, where the woman is being taken advantage of by the man. This is, the battle of the sexes is what they used to call it. And Ovid takes a kind of jauntist view of a lot of this, sometimes a humorous view, although sometimes, other times I think his humor does not translate well into modern society. He would be we would find him quite distasteful. For example, in one of these poems, the poet, I don't know if it's supposed to be Ovid speaking or some persona that he's assumed. The poem is about a man who has just beaten up his wife or his mistress or his lover, and he's bemoaning this, but at the same time he's essentially blaming the woman. He had no choice but to beat her. This is absolutely distasteful stuff, but it does give us an insight into what a patriarchal society can be like. Another poem is about a man who finally seduces his mistress, his would-be lover, into his bed, and then, of course, he has erectile dysfunction. And so the poem is him bemoaning this, and the woman, the object of his affections here, blames herself for this, and they have this big row. And it's humorous in a pathetic kind of way. But nonetheless, as love poems, These are not the kind of poems you would include in a Valentine's Day card, but as love poems describing male-female relationships at the height of the Roman Empire in a profoundly patriarchal society. It's really fascinating stuff. Love poems, Ovid. And then this novel, which kind of reading Ovid led me to this novel. It's called An Imaginary Life by David Malouf. This was written back in the 1970s. This is a fictional account of Ovid's time in exile. Ovid, as an historical figure, was part of the emperor's court, as I mentioned, but at some point Ovid had done something to offend Augustus, and he was thrown into exile, forced to live in the outer reaches of the Roman Empire, somewhere around the Black Sea, and then he was never allowed to return to Rome. We don't know what Ovid did to upset the emperor. We'll never know. But this novel, the way it was presented, I believed it was going to be a work of historical fiction. It was going to describe Ovid's life in exile. So I was very excited for that. It's a very well-written novel. The author is a poet. That comes across in his prose. It's very evocative, very imaginative. But I was also kind of disappointed in it, in that it turns out not to be a work of historical fiction. Ovid is just, the fact that Ovid is a Roman a citizen of the Roman Empire is incidental. You could have substituted any character. You could have had an ancient Greek or an Egyptian, or you could have set the story in the Middle Ages and had, the story of an exiled crusader, or it could be an exiled American. It's really just a fish out of water story. Someone who has been exiled from his homeland and all that he was familiar with and forced to live among a people who are completely alien to him. It would almost make a good science fiction story, someone from Earth exiled to another planet. So, so it was disappointing in that. I was hoping to get some insight into Ovid, but there's not much in here that references his life as a Roman, and what there is fairly generic. On the other hand, it's a good novel in that it's all about transformation and change. And as I said, it's very well written. It's not very long. It's a curious novel. I'm glad I read it. I would recommend it, but don't go into this thinking you're going to be reading a good work of historical fiction, because it really isn't that. It's just a good novel about a man exiled, a man forced to leave behind his homeland and try to learn to live among an entirely different people with a completely different culture. So, good book, though. An Imaginary Life. I just started reading John Williams' Butcher's Crossing. This is regarded as Williams' first novel. I've mentioned his other novel, Stoner, which I think is probably one of the greatest American novels ever, and also his other novel, Augustus. There's another tie-in with Ovid, which is also a wonderful novel. Butcher's Crossing is Williams' first novel. This is a Western, but of course written with the panache and style of John Williams. I've just started it, and already I'm hooked, and I'm looking forward to getting deeper into this one. Butcher's Crossing. The other book, I mentioned this one 2 weeks ago, the last time I had posted anything. It's Yardena Schwartz's The Ghost of a Holy War. The reason it's taking me so long to read this has nothing to do with the writing style. Miss Schwartz is an award-winning journalist. She's an excellent writer. It's a very compelling story, but it's also draining. It's emotionally draining. This is about the Arab-Israeli conflict. She starts the story in 1929 when about 70 Jews were suddenly massacred by their Arab neighbors, apparently without any warning or any real reason for it. And the 70 Jewish people, they were men, women, and children, and the account of this is absolutely horrific. And so from there, Ms. Schwartz traces through the ongoing conflict between the Israelis and the Arabs in the state of Israel and around the Gaza and all of this, which is still going on today. It's a heartbreaking story, and it's a story about essentially animalistic acts of terrorism followed by retribution, and then an attempt at peace. The attempt at peace collapses, and then there's another horrific act of terrorism followed by more retribution, another attempt at peace, and a collapse. And pretty soon it's just a litany of one horrific event after the next. And there are moments in this book of incredible courage but it's a people who, people caught in the crosshairs of history, and it's devastating. It's a difficult read in that sense. I haven't finished it yet. I'm just about at the ending. There are three big takeaways I've noticed in this. Is the three things which contribute to this never-ending cycle of violence. One of them is religious fanaticism. The second thing is disinformation in the form of a false history. Tell people a lie, keep repeating the lie, and people will start to believe it, and then they'll start to act on it, especially if the lie causes the people to feel as if they are put upon or being cheated or terrorized in some way. And then the third thing is an inability to accept that true evil really exists in this world. It's just a heartbreaking book. It's very difficult, but it's very, very important. It's an excellent overview of the tensions in that part of the world. And as I say, I haven't finished it yet. I don't know if Ms. Schwartz is going to find some glimmer of hope in all of this. It ends. I looked ahead. It ends with the slaughter of Jews which took place in the Gaza envelope of southern Israel. This was just 2 years ago, October 7th, 2023. It happened again. And now, of course, the Israeli response to this is just the complete, destruction of Gaza and the Palestinian peoples. It's just horrible. And so I don't know if Ms. Schwartz is going to be able to find any hope in this, but we'll see. It's worth reading, though. It's tough, it's grim, but it is worth reading. We should all understand what's really happening over there. And Ms. Schwartz, I think, does an excellent job of laying this out for us. And then the last book, which I just started reading, by Paul Claudel, who was a French intellectual, late 19th, early 20th century, is called Letters to a Doubter. And I've mentioned many times in this on my YouTube channel that I identify as a Roman Catholic, not a particularly good one, although I try my best. And so I think the title of this book is pretty self-explanatory, so we'll just leave it at that. So that's where I am now. Good to be back in the saddle, and I'll be posting regularly again beginning this week, beginning today. So that's it for now. Take care of yourselves and never, ever stop reading.